In this video, we'll be replacing the spark plugs and coils in a Lexus ES330. First thing you're going to want to do is remove the engine cover. There are 3 5mm hex bolts there. Then you're going to remove the coil bolts. They're 10mm bolts. And then remove the wire connector from the coil. You see he's using a small screwdriver there to get into that clip. And then you're going to remove the coils. If you are not replacing the coils and you're going to put them back in, you want to make sure that they go back in the same position as where you took them out. Then you'll need a 5/8 inch spark plug socket to get those spark plugs out. Then you'll remove the strut tower brace. There are 4 nuts, 14mm to replace that. And then disconnect the air box and the airflow sensor. Just disconnect that sensor. There's a tab there. And then you're going to need to disconnect the vacuum hoses. Disconnect the evap line. There's a clamp, just a 10mm bolt, loosen that up, and then the vacuum hose that's attached to the side. Then you can remove the air box. You're going to disconnect the throttle body connector, and then remove the throttle body. There are 4 10mm bolts holding that on. Then you're going to disconnect any of the lines and hoses that are holding onto the intake. You're going to disconnect the vacuum assembly and the purge valve. There are 2 10mm bolts or nuts holding those on. And then you should be able to disconnect the vacuum assembly. It might be a good idea to take a picture of all of that before you disconnect it all so that you're sure how to replace it. Disconnect the 10mm ground wire. And then you can remove the bolts from the intake. There are 3 14mm, 2 12mm bolts, and then 4 8mm hex bolts that you'll need to remove. You'll see that those a ratcheting wrench might come in handy. Anything that you can get in there to get to those bolts. Then you're going to remove the vacuum hose from the PCV and remove the intake. Once you have that off, you can remove the connectors from the coils. Again, he's just using a small screwdriver to push that clip in so he can unplug them. And you remove the 3 10mm bolts holding down those coils. And then remove the coils. And again, using the 5/8 spark plug socket, remove those remaining spark plugs. Before putting in the new plugs, he's going to apply little anti-seize to the plugs. And then install them, and using that spark plug socket, he's just going to tighten them by hand first to make sure that you don't strip them out. Once you know those threads have caught and you can tighten them by hand, you can continue with 20 foot-pounds to tighten those. And you can install new coils if you're putting new ones in, reconnect the wiring, and then remember there are 10mm bolts that hold those down. And you will tighten those down to 5 foot-pounds each. Need to clean the air intake and let it dry, and install new gaskets. You want to make sure that you clean that surface off and make sure that nothing falls into that intake, so just be careful when you're cleaning that. And then you can reinstall the intake. Reconnect the vacuum hose to the PCV valve, and then reinstall the intake bolts. You're going to tighten those down to 21 foot-pounds. Then you'll reinstall that ground wire onto the intake and tighten that nut to 5 foot-pounds. Then reconnect the vacuum assembly and the purge valve. There are two 10mm nuts, and you're just going to tighten those down to 5 foot-pounds. Reconnect the vacuum hoses and the throttle body. And those 4 bolts will be tightened down to 10 foot-pounds each. And you'll just reconnect all those vacuum hoses that you disconnected. Reinstall the air box and plug in the airflow sensor. You'll tighten those bolts down to 5 foot-pounds. There are two 10mm bolts there. Then you'll put that strut brace back on and tighten those 4 nuts to 35 foot-pounds. Tighten the clamps on the airbox. Don't forget to do that. They're two 10mm, just to 5 foot-pounds each. Reinstall the line to the PCV valve. reinstall the engine cover and tighten those 3 5mm hex bolts to 5 foot-pounds each, and you're all set.